If you've seen other videos on my channel, you probably are aware of my fondness for the Panasonic GH4, and that's because it's one of my favorite cameras that I've ever used. It has a lot of great features, but to be fair, I wanted to go over some of the reasons why it kind of sucks. And it does kind of suck. That doesn't take away from all the great stuff. There's a lot of great stuff, and I've talked about it in other videos, but there are three main things that I wish Panasonic would fix, either with a GH5 or with another model altogether, because there are some setbacks to the GH4. And I want to be fair, people probably think that I'm some GH4 fanboy, but I'm not. It just happens to be the camera that I like to shoot with the most right now. But that could change in a month, next year, who knows? Things change so fast in the camera industry that I want to shoot with what makes the most sense. I'm not going to gravitate towards a particular camera just because I like the brand or, I bought into it and therefore I need to justify the cost of the camera. It's more about just using the right tool for the right job. And the GH4 has some problems. The kind of first thing that I draw attention to is the codec and the bit rate. And 4K, you can shoot 100 megabits a second, which is pretty good. But when you're dealing with resolutions like 4K, you really should probably have a bit rate that's a little bit higher than that. You will notice some things that you shoot on the GH4 in 4K at 100 megabits it could look better if it didn't have the limitation of that compression. But that being said, it is still fairly good and fairly usable. Certainly something that 99% of people aren't going to notice. But some things that, like, every once in a while I'll look at and be like, oh man, I really wish that had a little bit higher bit rate just so I could get a little bit more out of it. And speaking of that, the codec itself, using a compressed internal codec, it is what it is. I understand that these DSLR type cameras are kind of limited to that. And having worked with ProRes files and RAW files, they do allow for greater flexibility in post-production. It's just the fact of you have more data, more information to play with. So you're going to be able to do more with coloring and manipulating the footage in post-production. So that's really nice. I personally sometimes find those files to be too large and have too much information, especially when you're trying to save space on hard drives and keep costs down and all that kind of stuff. So finding a nice balance between the two, whether it's just an improved, kind of compressed H.264, whatever, AVC HD codec they're on now, something that's kind of in between that would really be a nice sweet spot for me. I used the H.265 on the Samsung NX1, and I right now that is just not an option. Computers struggle to play back those files natively just because they're so compressed and it takes a lot of work to play them back. So having some kind of codec that's easy to edit but with a higher bit rate than what we currently have on the GH4 would be really nice to see in the GH5 or some other camera from Panasonic around that same price point, because that's one thing I love about the GH4. The price point is spot on. That is a really sweet area to be operating in, almost in an area where you could release a camera every year or two and people, professionals doing video or film production, would be able to afford getting those cameras and having them to own and not being limited to just rentals. The other thing that sucks about the GH4 is the sensor size. I know there are a lot of people who are fans of Micro Four Thirds, and it's nice in certain situations where you want to reach a little further and get that longer shot and see greater distances away, but it's really limiting in terms of depth of field. You're kind of right on that cusp where any smaller and you're not getting that same kind of cinema aesthetic that so many people recognize with shallow depth of field. People see that and they're like, oh, it looks like a movie. And most of us want to be shooting stuff like that because we want our stuff to be seen as being professional and high end. And that look is certainly a key part of that. So being able to control your depth of field by having a larger sensor would be really nice. And, full frame is cool and all, but I'd settle with Super 35. That's why I usually use a speed booster of some kind when I'm shooting with the GH4. But that also has its trade-offs and isn't always ideal, where you want to have this extra thing that you're carrying around. It'd be nice if the camera, you could just shoot as is with a larger sensor, get a little bit better noise performance, get a shallower depth of field, and be able to kind of do some stuff that you can't really do with the GH4 right now. Even if it was Super 35 and then you could get a speed booster to bump it up to full frame or full frame equivalent, that would be really, really nice. Full frame would even be potentially better for some people, but then you start competing with Nikon and Canon and Sony in their territory. And I get it. Panasonic wants to cater to a different market who's interested in the smaller sensor size. But for me, that is one of the things that really kind of knocks the GH4. And frankly, a lot of people look at the GH4 and they're turned off by the small sensor. I mean, that's one of the biggest objections that I hear people have with the camera. And there are tons of workarounds. You can get faster lenses, stuff that's like 1.8 and 1.4, just those faster lenses with the bigger aperture sizes. And you can get speed boosters and that kind of stuff, and you can frame certain way and make sure your camera placement's right to work around it, where it's never been a problem for me. But that being said, shooting with the NX1 or the A7S or even the 5D Mark III, full frame and the Super 35 sensor size do give you a little bit more flexibility and variety, especially when depth of field is what you're kind of going for. And most of the time, I want to have a shallower depth of field because that's what most people like to see. It just is. Sometimes it's not always appropriate, but a lot of times it is. So having a bigger sensor on the GH5 or another camera from Panasonic, again, around the same price point, they make the sensor size a little bigger. They probably have to increase the price because of manufacturing costs and whatnot, but it still would be really nice to see. And the final reason why the GH4 sucks is that it's not that great in low light. You've got cameras now like the A7S that are just performing so well in low light, and it's kind of unfortunate to look at the GH4 and say, like, you can't do that. You got to rent an A7S or something else that does a little better. So improving low light, and a lot of that probably would come from a bigger sensor size, so that would maybe kind of go hand in hand. But having a bigger sensor with bigger photo size so it can absorb more light and see into the dark would be really nice, and another nice thing for the GH5 or other future Panasonic camera to implement, just because, again, you want to make a camera, like, we're all aiming for this like perfect all-in-one camera, and it's never going to happen because people have different priorities. Some people want shallower depth of field, some people want greater depth of field. It's just, there's always trade-offs. Some people want a lot of resolution, some people want limited resolution, low light, whatever it might be. But the GH4 really sucks in low light. That's not to say that the high ISOs are bad. If you have a decent amount of light and you need to increase your ISO for whatever reason, whether it's shutter speed or aperture that you're trying to modify, you can do that, and it's not the worst thing I've ever seen. But if you're dealing with no light, as is often the case when people are talking about low light and using high ISOs, they really they want something that's going to be better than the GH4. So I've been in those situations too many times where I'm looking at the GH4 I have and say, this isn't the tool for the job, because I need to go get an A7S because I know lighting is going to be limited, whether it's at a concert, a wedding, whatever it might be. So it'd be nice to see Panasonic improve on some of that stuff. And every time a new camera comes out, I'm sure the GH5, they're going to say, it's got better low light. But they say that every time. The GH4 is better low light, supposedly, than the GH3. And the GH3 is better low light than the GH2. And the GH2 is better low light than the GH1. But they're not the leaps and bounds like we've seen with some of these other camera manufacturers. Sony especially. The A7S is just so beautiful in low light and next to no light, and you can still get something that's usable. It might not look the best, but you can definitely use it more so than you can with the GH4. So if Panasonic put together a GH5 or a different camera, whatever it might be, that had a better bitrate and codec, a bigger sensor, and better low light, and just kept everything else the same, I would be a happy camper. I love the ergonomics of the GH4. I love that it records to SD cards. I love that it records 4K, all the stuff, and mirrorless, like all the stuff that I've talked about. Like, I really like the camera, but there are certainly some setbacks and drawbacks, and I get it. I understand why it's not the perfect camera for everyone. There's people who really don't like the GH4, and I can understand and sympathize with that, because there are some things about it that aren't quite perfect. But hopefully, either Panasonic, Sony, Blackmagic, these camera manufacturers who are kind of catering to the more budget conscious consumers, they're really making strides and making a significant dent on Nikon and Canon. So I just really hope they keep it up, because those are the companies I want to support. I want to see the improvements that they're making and get some really cool cameras to play with. Higher frame rates, better low light, bigger sensors. It's the stuff we love.